4 past the hour. Joining us now, member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Democrat Chris Murphy of Connecticut. He's here with his new piece for The Atlantic entitled, How to Make a Progressive Foreign Policy Actually Work.
What is a progressive foreign policy?
Well, a progressive foreign policy is one that admits the mistakes of the past, right? Understands the limits of American power when you try to project force and influence around the world just through military might, but also understands that America can still play a role for good in the world. And we're going to have a lot of work to do after the Trump administration is done to try to reassert American influence when it comes to projecting human rights and democracy promotion around the world. And my hope is that, as I think Joe Biden is starting to realize, there is an opportunity in the 2020 election to go straight at Trump on the issue of national security. He has made the United States a laughing stock. He has walked us away from our historic role in promoting democracies and human rights around the globe. And that ultimately makes the United States less safe. And so I'm hoping that Democrats are going to run on national security. Historically, it's a big gap between Democrats and Republicans. And this is an election in which we can close it well, telegraphing to the American public that we get that the way in which we've thrown our military weight around the world hasn't worked. There's other ways to project force, to project influence.
At the same time, though, I mean, there are times we have to use military force, right? I mean, do you think Donald Trump made a mistake pulling troops out of Syria?
I do. I do in part because he had absolutely no plan for what came next. And so in that piece that I wrote for The Atlantic, I lay out exactly when military force is appropriate.
Let me ask you about Afghanistan.
Sure.
Donald Trump now wants to do a deal with the Taliban and have our troops pull out of Afghanistan just like we did in Iraq in 2011. Led to some really bad unintended consequences in Iraq, might do the same in Afghanistan. What does a progressive foreign policy look like in terms of Afghanistan? Do we just leave, or does it look like South Korea?
No, listen, I have supported the president's efforts to try to get a deal with the Taliban, and there are lots of conservative Republicans in Congress who would like to see us stay there for the next 40 years. But I think you need to use the tools that we have. We have leverage at this moment, and the leverage is American forces. And the fact that he is disappearing our leverage, right, pulling our troops out at the very moment where he's trying to get the Taliban to come to the table on a political deal is just, basic foreign policy mismanagement. And so, I think progressive foreign policy also involves a dose of realism. And in Afghanistan, if you're a realist, you have to use the troop presence today to try to get the Taliban to make concessions. But ultimately, I think we have proven without a doubt that the U.S. occupation of Afghanistan is not going to make that country a functioning Western-style democracy. And so we should stop having our bar for leaving Afghanistan be the end to corruption. We should make sure that al-Qaeda doesn't find a way to get back as using that country as a safe haven. And if we can get some basic guarantee on that, some assurance on that, I think that's when we get our troops back home.
As you know, Senator, one of the president's talking points we'll hear through the campaign is, I'm bringing the troops home. Let Syria fight for itself. Let them manage their own border. Let Turkey get involved if they need to. There was a report yesterday that he was considering sending 14,000 troops to Saudi Arabia as a buffer, perhaps, to Iran. He denied that on Twitter. You sit on foreign services. Do you know more about that? Or are we sending troops to Saudi Arabia?
I mean, what's stunning to me, having just come back from the region, is how his own military commanders in theater don't know what the policy is, right? So we were supposedly moving out of Syria, but we aren't anymore. We now have 500 troops that are once again trying to set up coalitions with the SDF in country. And in fact, we have more troops in the Middle East today than we did at the beginning of the Trump presidency. Maybe he's going to send a couple thousand more, but already we have more U.S. soldiers in CENTCOM, in theater, than we did at the outset. We've just moved them from one place to the other. And don't think that they're safe in Saudi Arabia, right? The provocative behavior that the president is engaged in today with Iran could end up putting those troops in jeopardy as well.
Senator Sam Stein has a question for you. Sam?
Hey, Senator, as we speak right now, the president's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, is again overseas in Europe meeting with Ukrainian officials and other foreign officials, ostensibly about Joe Biden and other election hackings in 2016. Two questions. One, is your committee keeping tabs on what's going on, or at least trying to? And two, in addition to this impeachment push, do you feel that Congress has a role here to legislate and codify limits to what personal attorneys can do with respect to foreign policy, and or to make sure and clear that foreign governments should have no role interfering in the U.S. elections?
Well, I think there's a bunch of different pieces to this. What we know is that the corruption didn't end when the impeachment process started. In fact, it's ongoing. The fact of the matter is these guys are shameless, and Giuliani is going to go back over and over and over again. I don't have any faith that the Senate Foreign Relations Committee is going to do anything about it. I went to the chairman of the committee back in April and asked for hearings into Giuliani's early attempts to try to interfere and had no success. And I think it's probably difficult to set congressional limitations on the way in which a president uses outside advisors. I mean, there is a long history of presidents being able to rely occasionally on people who don't officially work for the government to do business for the United States overseas. And so I'd have to think a little bit more about that. We might end up tying the hands of future presidents in a way that's not super constructive.
And Caddy Kay. Caddy?
So, Senator, one of the points of that Donald Trump gets in terms of favorability from people who are otherwise critical of his foreign policy is on his handling of China. And the argument is that in the past, presidents haven't taken on China. At least this president has done so. If you were to urge a progressive democratic foreign policy when it came to China, what would it look like? Would you continue the campaign? Would you urge continuing the campaign of pressure as this president has done on China?
Well, I think there's two pieces to it. You absolutely have to take on China's unfair trade practices, but you can't do it alone. Donald Trump is ultimately going to lose this trade war with China because China understands the leverage they have on him. As we get closer to the 2020 election, it's going to be Trump who has a short-term view that is desperate to get a deal. China, who always has a long-term view, is going to be able to sit back. And so we'll ultimately get a deal that's good for China and bad for the United States. What we should be doing in these negotiations is involving our partners. A progressive foreign policy is a multilateral foreign policy. And there are lots of willing potential partners in Europe that would love to be tough on China with us. Second, though, you have to understand what China's doing to export things like 5G all across the world. And if we don't start coming up with alternatives to these Chinese technologies that are going to lap American and Western technologies everywhere, then we can't compete with them. So that's about public investment in things like advanced battery technology and artificial intelligence so that we don't get caught with our pants down again like we have on high-speed internet connections.
How does a progressive foreign policy deal with supposed allies like Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Turkey?
So here's, I think, the most difficult question. I think we've got to push human rights and democracy, but it doesn't have to be an all-or-nothing proposition. I think there are some countries that cross a line where there have to be consequences. Saudi Arabia would be on my list, right? I think you have to telegraph that there is a point at which you have so abused the relationship, in which you have so abused your own people, that you can't be on the same terms as you used to be with the United States. And so I don't think a progressive foreign policy says if you're not a Western-style democracy, if you don't have a spotless human rights record, you can't do business with us. But it does set up a line in a way that this administration hasn't. And if we had said to Saudi Arabia after Khashoggi's murder that there's going to be a change in your relationship with the United States because of it, it would have been a notice to all sorts of other countries that they better get right, or at least try to get moving in the right direction, or there were going to be consequences. So it's not an all-or-nothing proposition, but you have to draw a line somewhere.
Quick final question, different topic. Have you spoken to a single Republican colleague in the Senate who's even considering voting for impeachment?
Yes.
You have?
Yes.
Okay.
Would you like to name him?
No.
How many? How many?
It's a small list on one hand.
Right. So
and by the way, I don't buy this secret ballot thing. Like, I mean, if there was a secret ballot, there'd still be only a handful of them that would vote to impeach this guy.
You think at the maximum right now that, given what we currently know, like maybe there's about 5 Republicans who might vote to remove the president at max?
I think that's probably right.
All right.
Okay, Senator Chris Murphy, thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Great.